when you look at the collapse of, like, a massive physical structure.
Right, like a building or something.
Yeah, let's say it's a suspension bridge that spans this massive river, or a 70-story skyscraper that just suddenly gives way. There is a universally accepted expectation of strict empirical precision.
Oh, absolutely. You don't call in a philosopher for that.
Exactly. You call in structural engineers. They look at the original blueprints. They test the tensile strength of the steel beams.
They're running metallurgical analyses to find, microscopic stress fractures.
Right, and eventually the engineer just points to a spreadsheet of data and says, there it is. The load-bearing columns experience a force exceeding their mathematical limit, and they failed.
It's clean. It's a completely binary, rational process. The failure is just a direct result of cause and effect.
It's so clean. I mean, you would never stand in front of a collapsed bridge and say to the press, well, the river was just feeling particularly angry today.
Right. Or, the bridge just didn't have enough faith in its own steel.
That would be totally absurd.
It would be, because that kind of empirical clarity is something we just instinctively demand in the physical world. We desperately need physical systems to be visible and governed by observable, repeatable laws.
Yeah, we have to.
I mean, if gravity was a mood, or if thermodynamics was just, based on luck, we couldn't build cities. We rely on the predictability of the physical universe for our very survival.
But, and this is where things get really wild to me, the absolute second you step out of the physical world and into the world of human civilizations.
Oh yeah, massive social system.
Exactly. When we talk about what makes a society survive or decay, that precision engineering mindset is completely thrown out the window.
It really is.
We look at a historical landscape full of collapsed empires, ruined economies, failed institutions, and suddenly we treat it like murky magic.
Right, we start using words like destiny or historical cycles.
Yes. Or worse, we assume that belief alone is the magical glue that was supposed to hold everything together, and, well, they just didn't believe hard enough.
It becomes the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. It's fascinating, really. I mean, we completely abandon the scientific method the moment we start talking about civilizational longevity or societal collapse.
We really do.
Yeah.
We act as if human societies operate in some mystical vacuum, immune to the laws of cause and effect.
Which is crazy.
It is. And that brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today. If you're listening right now, you might be prepping for, like, a high-stakes board meeting.
Or trying to understand how massive corporate systems operate.
Yeah, or maybe you are just deeply, insanely curious about what makes any human organization, from a 10-person startup to a global empire, survive the test of time.
Right.
Today, we are going on a deep dive into a foundational text from a completely different angle.
A really unique angle.
We are analyzing a lecture from the Tulu Islam Digital Audio Archive. Specifically, this is Lecture 717, delivered on May 4th, 1991. The focus of this lecture is this forensic dissection of a text, Surah Al-Ankabut, specifically Ayat 16 through 18 and 29-20. But we are completely stripping away the traditional lens of religious sentimentality.
Oh, far from it. We aren't doing Sunday school theology today.
Not at all.
We are putting on the hats of master sociologists and systems engineers.
I love that.
The premise we are extracting from this 91 lecture is that reality, and that includes human societal reality, runs on a coherent repeating order.
Okay, so the universe operates on unchangeable laws.
Yes. And true conviction, what we usually translate pretty poorly as faith, is actually built from rigorous field observation, not blind assertion.
Right, so we are reframing the very concept of belief. What if an ancient text wasn't asking for your emotional devotion?
What if it wasn't a mood board for spirituality?
Exactly. What if it was actually giving you a falsifiable, empirical set of lab instructions for human survival?
That is the exact paradigm shift the speaker in the lecture is proposing. True conviction is the conclusion you reach after analyzing the data of the world.
Not a prerequisite you force yourself to swallow before looking at the evidence.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack the vocabulary here. Because to even begin this systems engineering approach, the lecture argues we have to completely re-engineer the words we think we know.
We really do. The source zeroes in on the linguistic foundation of the text, starting with the Arabic word abudu.
Right. Now, in almost every conventional translation you'll find, Abudu is translated into English as worship.
Yes, and the source makes a highly compelling case that translating Abudu as mere ritualistic worship is not just like a slight mistranslation.
It changes the whole meaning.
It completely neuters the actual gravity of the concept.
Right.
When you say the word worship in the modern world, what do people picture?
They picture a highly individualized, fragmented action.
Exactly. You think of a personal puja or chanting a mantra in your living room or, completing a specific set of physical movements in a dedicated building once a week.
It's private. It's supposed to be this personal relationship.
Right. But the lecture points out that the linguistic root of this word in its original context actually meant obedience to a system or a set of laws.
Wait, wow.
It is about systemic alignment, not personal ritual.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you right there, because this feels like a massive historical stretch.
Okay.
If Ubuntu just means obedience to a system, how does that map onto the historical stories we all know? The source brings up the story of Abraham to illustrate this, right?
Yes, it does.
We're always taught that Abraham faced this fierce existential opposition from his society and his king, Nimrod, because of religion. Are you telling me Abraham wasn't a religious figure in this context?
I'm saying the lecture frames him as something far more dangerous to the status quo than a religious ascetic.
Oh, interesting.
Look at the socio-economic setup of a society like Nimrod's Babylon. If Abraham was just walking around the city saying, hey, I think we should all pray differently in the privacy of our own homes.
Or like, let's meditate facing a different direction.
Right. Why on earth would a powerful king care?
That's a good point. A king wouldn't care. As long as you pay your taxes and don't start a riot, kings historically do not care what you do in your living room.
Precisely. Nimrod wouldn't have mobilized the entire machinery of the state against him for a private ritual. The political and social friction only makes sense if Abraham was inciting a political and systemic rebellion.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
According to the source, Abraham was standing up against the human-made arbitrary laws of the state, the ad hoc legislation created by kings to subjugate the working class and maintain their monopoly on power.
Wow. So he was advocating instead for a universal objective system of laws.
Yes, what the text calls the divine system.
Okay, so he was essentially looking at Nimrod's socioeconomic model and saying, your laws are fundamentally flawed because they are mathematically designed to only serve the elite.
Exactly.
And I am advocating for the universal laws of nature, which are designed for the evolution and equity of all humans.
That's it. And when you do that, you aren't just a religious eccentric. You are a revolutionary threatening the entire architecture of the state.
I see it now. It's the difference between telling your city council that you think their logo is ugly versus organizing a massive campaign to stop paying municipal taxes and ignoring all the traffic lights because the laws are unjust.
That's a perfect analogy.
One is just a personal annoyance. The other forces the state to arrest you because you are threatening the systemic order.
Right. If you tell a king, I do not recognize your systemic authority because it conflicts with universal law, you are attacking the king's power directly.
It is so wild.
Which perfectly sets up the next massive linguistic hurdle the lecture clears, which is the concept of taqwa.
Oh, this one is huge. Traditionally, taqwa is almost always translated as fear of God or piety.
Yes, and that traditional translation implies the fear of an angry, emotional dictator sitting in the clouds.
Just waiting to strike you with a lightning bolt because you broke an arbitrary rule.
Exactly. But the lecture aggressively redefines this. Taqwa is not the fear of an emotional entity. It is the systemic understanding of structural consequences.
Let's dig into that mechanism. Because an emotional dictator operates on whim, right?
Yeah.
If a king is angry, you can bribe him.
Flatter him.
Yeah, you could write a poem about how great he is, and maybe he won't execute you. But if we're talking about universal laws, you can't flatter a system.
That is the exact distinction. The source uses a brilliant elemental analogy here. If you put your finger in a roaring fire, the fire will burn you.
Right. And the fire isn't angry at me. I didn't insult the fire's ego by touching it.
Exactly. The fire is simply operating according to its inherent physical laws, the laws of thermodynamics. It has no ego to bruise. Taqwa, therefore, is having the intellect and the foresight to fear the destructive consequences of breaking natural or social laws.
It's an internalized awareness of cause and effect.
Yes. If you violate the physical laws of thermodynamics, you get burned. If a civilization violates the socio-economic laws of equity, justice, and resource distribution, it collapses.
So it's not about appeasing a deity, it's about not being stupid.
Basically, yes.
It's essentially saying, respect the structural load limits of the suspension bridge we talked about earlier, because if you exceed them, you will fall into the river.
It's an instruction manual warning you about the operating limits of the machinery of life.
Yes. The system doesn't need you to follow its rules to stroke its ego.
The system is entirely indifferent to your praise. The laws are designed entirely for your benefit, for your survival, and your evolution as a society.
I love how this reframes authority. I mean, a human dictator demands your obedience for their benefit, to keep their throne. But a universal system demands adherence to its laws so that you don't destroy yourself.
Right. You benefit by not crashing the car. The car doesn't care if you crash it.
That is so well put.
And if we carry this engineering mindset forward, we really have to look at what happens when a society stops aligning with these universal laws.
Right.
Because if Abudu is systemic alignment and Taqwa is respecting the structural limits, what happens when a society just jams up and stops moving entirely?
Which takes us straight into the concept of idolatry. And this is where the lecture really blew my mind.
It's a huge shift.
Because again, the traditional image of idolatry is ancient people bowing down to statues made of stone or wood. It feels incredibly primitive and irrelevant to the modern world.
It does.
But the source material reframes this entirely. It defines idolatry as literal civilizational death.
It's one of the most profound linguistic unpackings in the entire 1991 lecture. The speaker looks at the Arabic word for idols, athan, or in Urdu, but parasti.
Okay.
And he reveals the deep linguistic root of athan. It literally refers to something that is static, jammed, entirely stuck in one place. It is fundamentally unable to move, evolve, or generate heat or kinetic energy. It embodies the Arabic concept of humud, which means total freezing stagnation.
Wait, so the problem with the idol isn't the material it's made of. It's not bad just because it is made of scone.
No, not at all. The physical stone statue is just a crude physical metaphor for the actual existential danger.
Which is what?
The danger is what the statue represents, an inability to change. Idolatry means bowing down to the status quo.
That makes so much sense.
To reinforce this, the source heavily integrates the concepts of the British philosopher and mathematician A.N. Whitehead. The lecture quotes Whitehead directly, stating, "The key note of idolatry is contentment with the prevalent gods."
Contentment with the prevalent gods. Let's pause on that and really pull that apart.
Yeah, let's do it.
What does contentment mean in this context? Because usually contentment is seen as a positive psychological trait. Like, you want to be content.
In a personal emotional sense, perhaps, but in a systems engineering or civilizational sense, what Whitehead and the source material is arguing is that idolatry means being entirely satisfied with however things are currently running.
Oh, I see.
It is the refusal to progress. It is looking at the systems, the knowledge base, the economic models, and the power structures of today and saying, this is perfect.
We have reached the pinnacle of human achievement.
Exactly. We never need to change, question, or adapt this system again.
That is terrifying when you apply it to the modern world, because if you pull this out of antiquity, you can see modern societies committing this exact type of idolatry everywhere.
Oh, it's everywhere.
It's not people bowing to statues, it's people bowing to outdated systems. Think about, like, a massive global tech conglomerate.
Okay.
Let's say they built their entire foundational infrastructure on legacy code from the late 1990s. At the time, that code was revolutionary. It made them billions of dollars.
Right, it was state of the art.
But now, it's 30 years later. The market has completely changed. Hardware has evolved exponentially. User needs are totally different. But the executive board sits in a meeting and says, no, we cannot touch the core code. It is sacred.
It is the foundation of who we are.
Exactly. It is what made us great.
Well, in the vocabulary of this lecture, they have just turned that 90s legacy code into an OFM. They have made it an idol.
Yes. They are practicing literal idolatry in the corporate boardroom. They are bowing down in total obedience to a static, unmoving system.
And what happens mechanistically?
The refusal to adapt to new knowledge. The desperate clinging to an outdated system just because it is familiar, comfortable, and previously successful.
That exact contentment with the prevalent gods leads to the inevitable death of the company.
Exactly. A newer, more agile competitor who isn't burdened by that idol comes along and wipes them off the map.
And that corporate analogy maps perfectly onto the civilizational scale discussed in the source. When human institutions, governments, or legal frameworks refuse to adapt to the expanding frontiers of human knowledge, they are committing civilizational idolatry.
It's systemic suicide.
It is. The lecture uses a very vivid natural analogy to explain the mechanics of this humud, the stagnation.
What's the analogy?
Think of a massive oak tree in late autumn. It has lost all its leaves, it looks completely static, but it might still be alive deep inside, just waiting for the environmental conditions of spring to trigger growth.
Okay, that's natural.
However, if a disease rocks its roots, if it becomes entirely hollowed out from the inside, it is dead. Even if the massive trunk is still standing tall and looks imposing, the potential for any future growth is permanently gone.
It has the outward appearance of an imposing entity, but none of the internal mechanics of life. It's a zombie tree.
Precisely. And eventually, a strong wind will blow it over because the structural integrity is gone. The source contrasts this deadly stagnation of humud with the absolute non-negotiable necessities of life. Harakat, which translates to movement or kinetic action, and tika, which is continuous evolution.
So life requires movement.
By its very definition in this framework, life requires continuous, forward-moving kinetic energy. Stagnation isn't just a temporary pause, it is literal structural death.
Right.
If you as a society are not moving forward, adapting and evolving, you are just a decaying idol waiting for the wind to knock you over.
Okay, but how does a whole society get tricked into stopping? Because you don't usually see a vibrant civilization just suddenly wake up one Tuesday and decide, you know what, let's just stop progressing and die.
No, it doesn't happen overnight.
It has to happen slowly. And usually it seems like it happens under the guise of something noble, like respecting tradition.
That is exactly how the decay sets in. The lecture moves chronologically to diagnose how this idolatry morphs over time into the worship of ancestors, known as aslaf, and the rigid, unquestioning adherence to ancient jurisprudence, known as fiqh. And the source makes a highly nuanced, brilliant point here. It does not say the ancestors were stupid, it's actually the exact opposite.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it points out that the laws, systems, and philosophies created 1,000 years ago were absolutely brilliant, but for their specific era,
Right. Context matters.
those ancestors used their intellect, their rigorous critical thinking, to solve the unique, pressing problems of their time.
So they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. They were using harakat movement to adapt to their environment.
Yes. But forcing the specific, finalized solutions of the year 1000 AD onto the highly complex society of today without understanding the underlying reasoning, without asking why,
Right.
which the source terms tafaq, or deep critical thinking, doing that is intellectual suicide. Taking the endpoint of someone else's critical thinking and making it your unquestioned starting point without ever replicating the critical process itself is how a civilization ossifies and turns into stone.
Let me play devil's advocate here, because I know there is a listener thinking this right now.
Go for it.
Shouldn't a civilization revere its past? I mean, isn't looking at our past achievements, our history, our traditions, how we maintain our identity and our cultural continuity?
It's a fair question.
If we just constantly abandon everything our ancestors did and rebuild from scratch every generation, wouldn't we just be chaotic and unmoored? How do you balance evolution with identity?
That is the exact tension the source addresses, and it again pulls heavily from A.N. Whitehead to explain the mechanics of it.
Okay.
The quote used in the lecture is crucial to understand here. A passive knowledge of the past loses the whole value of its message.
Passive knowledge. Let's break down what that actually means.
Well, the source argues that yes, a living civilization absolutely requires learning from the past. You don't ignore it, but it must live beyond it.
Live beyond it.
The true greatness of past historical thinkers wasn't in the specific localized rules they wrote down. Their greatness was in their ability to be radical, progressive, and deeply analytical for their specific time. They were innovators who challenged their own status quo.
Oh, wow. Okay, my mind is slightly blown here. So if we just blindly copy their ancient rules today, we are actually betraying their legacy.
Exactly.
Because they were forward-thinking. And by
Yeah.
copying them, we are being backward-looking.
Yeah.
We are adopting their static endpoints, but we are completely ignoring their methodology of critical inquiry. We're doing the exact opposite of what made them great.
Exactly. To truly honor an innovative ancestor, you have to be an innovator in your own time. A passive knowledge just memorizes what they did and recites it.
Right.
An active knowledge extracts how they thought, understands their engine of reason, and then applies that same engine to today's novel problems.
And if you only use passive knowledge, you get trapped in a behavioral loop. You are just repeating actions without generating any new value.
Yes.
This brings up the lecture's massive philosophical contrast between the ancient Greek philosophy of cyclic history and the Quranic concept of linear progress.
This is a fundamental divide in how humanity views time and purpose. The Greek model, the cyclic view, suggests that history is just an endless, inescapable repetition.
Empires rise, they reach a peak, they fall, and then they rise again.
Exactly, going in a massive circle over centuries without any ultimate forward destination. The source argues that this cyclic repetition is the hallmark of a stagnating, idolatrous society.
Really?
It creates what Whitehead beautifully calls a show of civilization without any of its reality. You go through all the motions, you repeat the grand rituals, you wear the traditional robes, but no new human value or knowledge is actually generated.
I'm picturing a society trying to drive a car by only looking in the rearview mirror.
That's good.
You might feel like you're moving because the scenery in the mirror is changing, but you are totally blind to the road ahead, and eventually you are going to crash.
Or it's like walking on a treadmill.
Oh, yeah.
You are exerting massive amounts of energy, you were sweating, your legs are moving fast, but you aren't actually traveling anywhere new.
That treadmill analogy is perfect. In contrast to that, the source highlights the Quranic concept of Sirat al-Mustaqim. Now, traditionally, this is translated as the straight path.
Right.
But in the context of this systems engineering analysis, it means a continuously forward-moving, linear trajectory of evolution.
It is not a repeating circle. It is an arrow shot forward. Repetition without original thought, without actively pushing the boundary of human capability into new frontiers, is essentially abandoning the arrow to get back on the treadmill.
Okay, so if the treadmill is civilizational death, how do we get off of it? How do we
Right.
break free from this civilizational idolatry and this passive past worship?
This is where the lecture shifts from diagnosing the disease to prescribing the actual cure.
This is the engine of reason segment of the deep dive, right?
Oh.
And honestly, this is the part that completely rewrites the faith versus science debate.
It really does. It leans heavily into a specific verse, Surah 29, Ayat 20. And again, the paradigm shift here is jarring if you are used to the traditional leap of faith narrative where religion asks you to turn off your brain.
Right. This verse does not say, close your eyes, silence your doubts, and just believe what you are told. It gives a literal physical command.
The verse says, Siru fe allard and fanzuru. Let's do a rigorous linguistic deep dive on those specific verbs because the mechanics of how they operate are crucial.
Let's look at Siru Fialard. This translates to travel or move through the earth, but it's not talking about taking a vacation.
No.
It is a command to mobilize, to get out of your armchair, to get out into the field.
Okay.
And then comes Fanzuru, which means then observe, investigate, or consider. It is directed, empirical attention. It is a research methodology. The text is literally telling the reader to act as a field scientist.
And what exactly are we supposed to be observing out in the field? The verse says to observe Bada al-Khalq and al-Nasha al-Akhira. What do those terms mean in a systems context? How do they map to the scientific method?
Bada al-Khalq refers to how creation or any complex process was initiated or originated, how things begin.
Origination, okay. And al-Nasha al-Akhira refers to the later formation, the renewed or subsequent reproduction of that process, the feedback loop.
Wow.
So the text is explicitly saying, go out into the physical world and study how systems begin, how processes originate, and then rigorously observe how those processes repeat and produce subsequent results over time.
That is a literal lab instruction.
It really is.
It's saying, go study the fossil record to see how biological life originated and evolved. Study cellular biology, study sociology, economics, and the history of collapsed empires. Look at the hard data.
Yes.
Conviction, or what we lazily call faith in this register, is not your starting point. It is the rational conclusion you reach after you have walked the earth and read the observable record.
Exactly. This completely destroys the tyranny of unproven assertions. Reality runs on a repeating, observable order that is entirely falsifiable. You can test it.
Yes.
If someone claims a societal model works, you don't have to just believe them. You can test it against the historical and physical record.
And that is the rational engine made explicit. The system stakes its claim on observable patterns, not on unverifiable myths or invisible magic.
Right.
If you want to know if the laws of cause and effect are real, don't take the lecturer's word for it, and don't take the ancient text's word for it blindly. Go look at the archaeological remains of societies that ignored economic justice and see what mechanically happened to them.
The processes of origination and renewal are open to human inspection.
Which brings us to one of the heaviest systemic concepts in the source material, the law of Weissel, or Bukafati Amo. If I'm understanding the mechanics of this correctly, this is entirely about feedback loops.
That is exactly what it is in systems theory terminology. Mukafade Amal is the structural consequence embedded in the cycle of origination and renewal.
Right.
If the universe operates on predictable laws, then cause and effect isn't just a philosophical idea, it is the structural mathematical reality of the universe. The later formation, that al-Nasha al-Akira, follows from the first phase by strict law. The outputs of any system feed directly back into the system as new inputs.
So the later formation is the strict accounting of the first, meaning every single action a society takes, every law it passes, every economic policy it enforces, that is an input into the machine.
Yes.
And the universe will inevitably, mechanically, return an output based on those unchangeable laws.
Absolutely. If you read the cycle honestly, you grasp that consequences are entirely structural. Let's walk through a historical mechanism.
Yeah, let's do an example.
If a society ignores these empirical patterns, let's say it hoards wealth at the top, it stifles intellectual freedom, it crushes the working class, and it worships its past instead of innovating for its future.
Sounds familiar.
The consequence isn't an angry deity magically throwing a lightning bolt to punish them. The consequence is systemic collapse brought on by the very laws of sociology, resource management, and economics that govern human interaction.
Right.
The wealth hoarding leads to poverty, which leads to unrest, which leads to revolution or vulnerability to outside invasion. Ignoring the pattern is objectively mathematically costly.
It's like reverse engineering, an incredibly complex piece of hardware, maybe, like an alien spacecraft that you found crashed in the desert.
Oh, I like this.
The instruction manual you find inside doesn't say bow down to the shiny metal casing, light some incense, and chant songs to it. That won't make it fly.
Not at all.
The manual says take it apart, study the circuitry, see how the original engineer built the propulsion system, understand the laws of physics it utilizes, and then apply those repeating laws to build the next iteration of the machine yourself. You have to understand the operating system to survive in it.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And the tools of observation, the ways we reverse engineer that universal machinery, advance across eras.
Oh, sure.
The way humanity studied the Earth and gathered data in the year 1000 AD is vastly different from how we study it now with electron microscopes, satellite imagery, and massive data analytics.
Right, the tools are better.
The tools change, the precision of our data changes, but the invitation to verify the system through observation remains constant. The text hands you a method for civilizational survival, not a mood or a feeling.
That is an incredible paradigm shift.
Yeah.
But it brings up a massive question.
What's that?
If the whole point of human existence is to continuously observe, learn, adapt, and evolve, to maintain that harakat, that forward movement, what happens when we reach the finish line?
Oh.
What happens to the concept of permanence versus change? If we are always changing, is anything permanent?
The lecture synthesizes this tension between permanence and change beautifully. It posits that in this vast system, there is only one permanent entity, and that is the ultimate lawmaker, the source of the universal laws themselves.
Okay, so the laws are permanent.
The laws are permanent, but everything else in the universe, by definition, must change, adapt, and move forward to survive. The source quotes Surah Ar-Rahman, verse 29, which says, "Every day he is in a new state."
Every day in a new state. That implies continuous, infinite, dynamic action. It's not static.
Exactly. It completely shatters the idea of the universe as a wound-up clock that is just slowly, inevitably ticking down to zero in heat death.
Right.
The universe is constantly demanding new responses, generating new potential, creating new complexities, and this brings the speaker to a fascinating, highly philosophical point regarding the ultimate destination, the concept of heaven, or Jannat.
Okay, yes, let's unpack this, because the traditional view of heaven is basically the ultimate eternal retirement home.
Pretty much.
You get there, you sit on a ridiculously comfortable couch, you eat peeling grapes, and you do absolutely nothing for the rest of eternity. It is the very definition of static contentment.
And based on everything we have discussed today about idolatry, Athan being static, humud and life-requiring movement, harakat.
A static heaven would logically be a massive contradiction of the very nature of life itself.
Exactly. The source, drawing heavily on the philosophical poetry of Muhammad Iqbal, argues that this traditional version of a static, do-nothing heaven would actually be sheer, unadulterated torture for the human spirit.
Wait, really? A static paradise would be torture? Let me think about the mechanics of that. I suppose if the human drive is built for evolution, built for problem solving, built for overcoming challenges,
Yes.
wouldn't arriving at a final destination where all problems are instantly solved essentially be a death sentence for human motivation?
That is precisely Iqbal's argument and the lecture's argument. To explain this mechanistically, the speaker in the source material does another brilliant linguistic deep dive, this time into the Arabic word for life, hayat.
Okay.
He draws a direct connection to the linguistic root used for a snake, hayat.
A snake? How does the biology or behavior of a snake explain the concept of eternal life in heaven?
Think about how a snake behaves in its natural environment. A snake might be coiled up, looking perfectly still, completely static to the naked eye. It looks like an idol.
Right.
But the absolute second you touch it, or a prey animal comes near, it explodes with intense, violent kinetic energy and movement. It is a coiled spring of pure potential.
Yeah.
True life, Hayat, is defined by this kinetic energy, this latent power ready to uncoil and strike forward. Therefore, life cannot exist without the capacity for rapid forward momentum.
So if you remove the potential for forward momentum, if you remove the need to strike or move, you remove life itself.
Exactly. Therefore, even in the ultimate state of success, what is termed heaven, there cannot be a final stop.
Because a final stop equals stagnation.
Which we've rigorously established as civilizational and spiritual death. Heaven, in this systems engineering paradigm, is not a retirement home.
Right.
It is an eternal journey of setting new goals, infinite evolution, and endless forward momentum. It is a continuous unrolling of the universe's infinite potential, where you are constantly unlocking new levels of understanding.
It's not the end of the video game where the screen just says you win and freezes forever while a song plays.
No, not at all.
It's unlocking an infinite number of new, increasingly complex and fascinating levels, and you finally have the upgraded hardware to play them all perfectly.
Yes, that's a great way to visualize it. The lecture references Iqbal's poetry to illustrate this beautifully.
What does he say?
Iqbal writes about how the human heart would literally die in a static paradise. He says that the human spirit doesn't want the static, unchanging beauty of an idol. It wants the thrill of the chase.
The thrill of the chase.
It wants the wind, the storm, the continuous reaching for a horizon that constantly expands the closer you get to it. If you give the highly evolved human intellect a puzzle that is completely finally solved, it gets bored and it decays. The joy, the life force is in the act of solving, the act of discovering.
That completely reframes the entire purpose of human existence for me. We aren't here on Earth to just pass a bizarre arbitrary test so we can go sleep on a cloud forever.
Exactly.
We are here to develop the kinetic energy, the rigorous intellect, and the systemic alignment required to participate in the endless evolution of the universe.
And doing that requires abandoning the passive knowledge of the past. It requires you to actively stop worshiping the static idols of your current worldview. You have to stop being content with the prevalent gods of your society's current flawed achievements. You have to travel the earth, observe the systems of origination and renewal, truly understand the structural consequences of the law of requital, and actively participate in the forward momentum of reality.
Okay, we need to zoom out and summarize the massive paradigm shifts we've covered today, because this has been an incredibly dense, profound journey.
It really has.
We started by moving away from seeing faith as a blind emotional leap and redefined it as empirical field observation, a conviction built entirely on verifiable data.
Yes.
We entirely redefined idolatry.
Yes.
It's not about primitive people bowing to stone statues. It is the highly modern intellectual and civilizational stagnation of being satisfied with the status quo.
We established that the survival of any civilization depends on its ability to learn from the past without being paralyzed by it. It's about adopting the critical methodology of your innovative ancestors without blindly copying their static endpoints.
And we explored how this 91 lecture dissects a foundational text to reveal a verifiable scientific method for aligning with the universal laws of cause and effect.
Right.
It hands you a rigorous method for civilizational survival, not a fleeting emotional mood.
And if we bring all of this high-level systems theory right down to your doorstep, to you listening to us right now, whether you are running a business, leading a team of engineers, shaping public policy, or just trying to manage your own intellectual growth, the law of requital applies to you.
Yeah, the feedback loops are real. They are happening right now.
They are structural and they are inescapable.
Yeah.
If you become content with your prevalent gods, meaning you become arrogant about your current skill set, your current business model, or your current worldview, you enter a mathematical state of decay.
You become an idol.
But if you maintain that kinetic energy, that hayat, you align yourself with the endless, thrilling evolution of the system.
Which brings us all the way back to where we started, the collapsing bridge. We don't look at a failed physical structure and blame magic. We look at the physics. We look at the load-bearing columns.
Always.
So, I want to leave you with a chilling but hopefully deeply inspiring question to mull over today. Look around at the human institutions you participate in every single day. Your workplace, your local government, your educational systems.
Yeah.
Look at the architecture of your own daily routines.
Are they engines of constant empirical evolution?
Are they actively studying the data, the processes of origination and renewal to build a better future?
Mm.
Or are they just performing the repetitive, exhausting show of civilization, desperately worshiping the passive knowledge of the past while the structural foundations quietly rot from the inside? And more importantly, when you look in the mirror, which one are you?